Good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome along to our August webinar, which is titled Beyond Trauma, a Space to Heal and Grow. And I'm delighted to welcome along two colleagues of mine in the world of psychotherapy and psychology to contribute to this discussion around a life beyond trauma and the link between trauma and mental health, which serves the purpose of speaking to the area of trauma and depression in relation to the information and support and education that it can provide you as the audience this afternoon as we listen to our contributors, Dr. Grace Sheridan, who's a clinical psychologist, and Cariosa Walsh, who's an individual psychotherapist and group analyst. And it's important for me to note at this time to the audience that both Grace and Cariosa are here in a personal capacity and not representing the organizations that they work for. And now, as I introduce Cariosa and Grace, just individually to say a little bit about themselves, and then we'll start off into the discussion together. So if I start with you, Cariosa, just to briefly introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm delighted to be here. So my name is Cariosa Walsh, as you said, and I'm an individual psychotherapist and a group analyst. I'm currently working with adult survivors of childhood trauma, deliver individual psychotherapy and group therapy to that client group. And I'm very interested in the area of mental health and well-being and the things that we can do, I suppose, in the everyday outside of the specifics of counselling to mind our mental health, which all of us need to do. So.
Thank you, Cariosa. And over to you, Grace.
Thanks, Stephen. Hello, everyone. And as Stephen has mentioned, my name is Grace Sheridan. I'm a clinical psychologist working in the public health service. And I work with adults that are experiencing mental health problems, most of which are long lasting and can be severe. And those are problems like psychosis and schizophrenia, and also bipolar and depression. And more often than not, people with those types of mental health problems have quite a significant history of trauma, especially early life trauma. And I also have a research interest in this area, and I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to complete some research at UCD along with Professor Alan Carr, and that research looked at post-traumatic outcomes in adult survivors of childhood abuse and neglect in Ireland, and it had a particular focus on post-traumatic growth. And I'm planning on talking a little bit about that research and some of the science behind post-traumatic growth today.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you very much. And just for you as an audience, please use the Q&A function there if you have any questions or thoughts or observations as the conversation between the three of us unfolds that you want to ask. And I can filter those questions to both Cariosa and Grace as the conversation goes on. And hopefully we'll get to as many as possible of the questions that you may have. And also just to say to you, and I'll reiterate this at the end again, if any of you are impacted by the material that's covered by this, we would really advocate as a first protocol for people to make an appointment perhaps with their GP as an initial step if you're impacted by what comes up in the coming time around this conversation, because I'm very conscious of what can unfold or be unearthed by a conversation about trauma and early childhood events. So without further ado, if I was to come to you first, Grace, and to ask you a little bit about the research work that you've done and what links that you have found perhaps in that work, and also your practical work, the work that you do as a practitioner between trauma and mental health and depression.
Yeah, I guess, I'm wondering it might be helpful to kind of maybe first explain what we mean by trauma. We hear the term quite a lot. And in short, it's really like the emotional shock that we feel after extremely stressful, can be life-threatening, can be life-altering sort of events. And those events can be very mild in nature to very serious, and the emotional shock that comes from them can also have that range as well. I think, some of the distinct qualities of traumatic events are that they're unexpected, they're unpredictable, they're overwhelming, and they can be really difficult for people to come to terms with. And some traumas are very personal, and other traumas are very impersonal. And maybe another way to think about those differences is whether they're accidental traumas or non-accidental traumas. An example of sort of both of them might be where an accidental trauma might be receiving a diagnosis, maybe of a or treatment for a life-threatening illness or a road traffic accident. A non-accidental trauma will be purposely carried out by someone else. And that's probably what I'm going to focus a lot of mine on today, which will be around kind of experiences of childhood abuse and neglect, where harm has been perpetrated purposely by another person. And, you know, trauma really can affect us profoundly because it can make us feel like our lives, that we're not in control of our lives. It can make it very difficult to feel safe and trust other people, and we can lose trust in judgments and in ourselves. And on top of that, you know, some people can feel very ashamed and frightened about the things that happen to them. And that's something that happens a lot with people who have survived childhood abuse and neglect. They might feel ashamed about what happened to them, how they coped, how they're coping now. And it's not uncommon to hear traumatized people talk as if they were responsible for what happened to them, you know, and saying things like, I should have told someone about the abuse or what was happening, or I deserved it. We know that, you know, there's various forms of kind of traumatic stress that can come after those experiences. So some people might be familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's also more complex forms of kind of traumatic stress disorders like complex post-traumatic stress. What we were quite interested in our research is kind of focusing some research on understanding, I suppose, outcomes more broadly, and that will also do kind of growth outcomes, which I guess is what we're kind of hoping to focus on today. So our research a few years back now, kind of around 2017 to 2018, 19, focused on post-traumatic growth. And I don't know if people are familiar with the kind of the concept or the idea of post-traumatic growth, but kind of in a nutshell, it's the idea that, you know, some people not only recover from life-threatening, life-shattering traumatic events, but also experience a positive transformation. And that can be in various different areas, but it's usually around kind of positive transformations in their values, in their relationships, and in their actions in their life. So, for example, people might develop a new understanding of themselves or the world they live in, you know, how they relate to other people, maybe the kind of future that they have. Maybe they'll experience positive improvements or transformations in the relationships. But with post-traumatic growth, it's not a direct result of trauma. So there's middlemen in there. So the idea behind post-traumatic growth is that people who endure a kind of a struggle and hardship following the adversity and following the trauma, it's kind of within that piece that they often see growth afterwards. So it's a person's struggle to come to terms with this new reality in the aftermath of trauma that prompts growth. And the metaphor of an earthquake is often used to sort of describe this process.
Very helpful, yes. Yeah,
so like kind of in much of the same way that an earthquake will have a serious impact on sort of the physical structure and the physical environment, a very significant and traumatic psychological event can really shake and threaten and upend really a survivor's existing belief system. And what I mean by belief system is the beliefs that a person holds very strongly at their core about themselves, about other people, and about the world. And for people who have had experiences of childhood abuse and neglect, they develop from a very early age, and they can often be quite negatively toned. So people have very negative beliefs about themselves. So I'm disgusting, there's something wrong with me, nobody could love me. They have beliefs about other people are out to harm me, or you know, just kind of an expectation that other people harm me. I'm vulnerable to harm from other people. The world is a dangerous place. For people who haven't had experiences of childhood abuse and neglect, and generally have had probably more stability in their life growing up, we would expect that those beliefs, that they wouldn't have those sorts of beliefs. So when a very significant traumatic psychological event comes in and sort of shakens that, the idea is that a person's sense of safety can be challenged, their identity can be challenged. And sticking with the metaphor of the earthquake, in the same way that a physical rebuilding happens after an earthquake so that the physical structures are a bit more robust and that they're more resistant to shocks, a person's belief systems are also rebuilt after trauma so that they take into account the changed reality of life. So trauma can shatter a person's view of the world, and post-traumatic growth is thought to be the result of a person sort of trying to put their worldview back together in a way that incorporates the trauma event. So the survivor sort of comes out the other end changed in some way. So it sort of allows you to sort of what we call cognitively kind of putting those pieces together and making sense of the event and what happened in as far as it can be, with a view to sort of moving on with your life. Now, with post-traumatic growth, you know, it's not this idea that you have something awful happens to you, and you try to come to terms with it, and then things are great from there on out. Actually, what most of the research has kind of told us, in the studies that have also assessed for PTSD symptoms, the majority of survivors will also hit PTSD symptoms severely enough that will give them that will bring them to a diagnosis of PTSD. So that tells us that actually people who report growth don't necessarily feel less distressed. And I think that's something that's really important.
Very important, yes.
Yeah, because that tends to get lost in media coverage. It sort of tends to get lost in public understandings of post-traumatic growth. And I suppose just to say, we have to be quite cautious with championing terms like resilience and post-traumatic growth, because it can put unfair expectations on people. And
very good.
Yeah, and people can kind of, so, you know, survivors can kind of come to the belief that, gosh, not only do I have to get over this and move past this, but I actually have to experience transformations in all these different areas. And the reality of post-traumatic growth, it's just a lot more complex than that. And, you know, the reality is that there's a lot of factors influence how people kind of recover and adapt after the traumas that they've experienced. It's just not that simple.
Very helpful, Grace, just as an opening kind of discussion or description of what you have seen in your work, and also from the research that you've done, what the journey is like. And I suppose if I was to use some of that and listening to you and to ask you, Cariosa, about what are some of those factors, or what do you see in your work that may be important, or how it comes about this. And I suppose it's so important to be hopeful and say that transformation or change can happen, and yet that it's also not just an easily done thing, or it's not guaranteed. But some of the factors in that too, that maybe you have seen in your work and working with people who have experienced early childhood trauma.
Yeah, I just think the way that Grace has described it there, it's just so helpful and so accessible. And it really is key that I suppose what I would see mostly presenting is people who have run into difficulties in relationship. Really, that's the presenting issue, that there's some difficulties in relationship. So when we sit down and we look at that, basically what can be at the core of that very often is that coping strategies that were identified and made use of as a child and helped the child survive and to get through, if we're talking about early childhood trauma, they no longer serve the person as they move into adulthood.
Yes.
And the main place that will show itself is in the person's relationship with both with themselves, but also in relationship with others. And so it might happen in the workplace or in intimate relationships, family relationships. And when we look at that and start to pare back, again, the belief systems, the shame, just how people cope in their day, and often it's through withdrawal and isolation, because it's been withdrawal and isolation and secrecy that the child has learned early on that protects them. And but of course, as they get older, that doesn't allow them to be able to relate. So I suppose there are some core things that I would say to people when they present, that first of all, just as Grace said, the way that we are, the way that we have learned to adapt, it's not so much getting rid of that, which often people have a desire to be rid of something that isn't serving them anymore. It's actually learning to understand how that has come to be incorporated into the way that we live, and how that has helped us to survive. But you know, it's problematic in certain situations. So it's about learning how to live with something. And it's in relationship that you will learn that. I suppose obviously that's what I'm promoting as a therapist, that it's in relationship. So it's in your relationship with yourself and then in your relationship with others, but not necessarily that you have to go to counselling to do that, because we're in relationship with ourselves all of the time. So I suppose fundamentally I would be encouraging people and anybody who's listening around noticing how they are in the everyday, noticing what impacts their mood, noticing what impacts their behaviour. Like sometimes can be overeating or undereating, you know, controlling or eating, maybe using alcohol as a way to manage anxiety, particularly in social situations, feelings of boredom, loneliness. It can be being highly reactive with not appropriate to maybe the event that has occurred, or it can often be very needy, you know, and kind of clingy in relationship, you know, which would all be signs of saying what is being activated in me. And that, so there are loads of ways of trying to become more familiar with that, like loads of self-help books, loads of podcasts that you can begin and notice. I would say to people, notice what you're drawn to, what speaks to you, and that it's highly subjective. It's not one size fits all, but there are, like, I suppose there are 5 key factors that help, you know, promote good well-being in the everyday. And this is what all of us should be paying attention to every single day, that we all have control over. So one is our diet. Like what we eat impacts how we feel, and the way we eat impacts how we feel. Exercise, so that's in terms of movement, you know, where move the body and the mind will follow. And that idea also, that research shows that being in nature, even for up to 20 minutes a day of even just sitting in nature, positively impacts our nervous system. And also exercise is a way of being in contact, can be a way of being in contact with people without having to overly engage. So say, like, for example, you go to a yoga class, you'll go and you'll meet people going in and going out, you're going to class, so you can say hello to people without having to enter into conversation, you know, and some people might find kind of threatening or challenging to do. Then we have sleep, of course, a good sleep routine, you know, getting a structured sleep, also the replenishment of that. Then building our awareness, which is key. So looking at our awareness inside of ourselves, in our surroundings, in our relationships with others, and how we're impacted by certain things, and beginning to listen to that and to respect that. Because as Grace was saying, that when we're young, we can develop beliefs that aren't actually accurate, you know.
Yes, and I was going to come to that now in a minute, but go on, keep
and just
going.
The final one is just to connect. And so about connecting with ourselves and paying attention to ourselves, but also connecting with others. And so how we do that, of course, can be challenging, but there's like a term called like loose social connections. That's the idea of, like, something as simple as when you're walking down the street, of making eye contact and acknowledging the person that you're, you know, coming up to the bus stops and hello, you know, not entering into a huge conversation, but you know, if you're going to the same shop every day, saying hello, like starting to just have these loose social connections of noticing others and being noticed. And that it's very important for a sense of community, whether, you know, all the different ways that you can do that. It'll be different for different people and what you feel comfortable with.
Right, that's very helpful, Cariosa, just to get a sense of your sense of working through something, and some of the hopefulness in that, but also perhaps some of the barriers. And it seems to me, listening to you both in your opening remarks, is that we're talking about intimacy, trust, and trying to navigate, and because we're in relationship with ourselves in the world, and we're born to relate to other people in the world by being social beings. So when that's intruded upon intentionally and non-intentionally to do with a trauma that has been experienced, whether it's a singular event or whether it's a pattern of a relationship, and the debilitating impact of that on anyone's life that needs to be thought about. And I think that's what we're in the business of speaking about now. And just to tune into one of the strands that I've been listening to is if we could spend a couple of minutes thinking about the belief systems and some of that. And I think you touched on it, Grace, when you mentioned about shame and self-blame, and what kind of maybe is the antidote, or what's the, if not way around that, but I suppose, I don't want to rush to thinking about being beyond trauma, but we're holding out the space for hope, but also we're thinking a little bit about the impact of that, and how self-blame and kind of the internal critic, the critical voice that can go on in one's mind, can be very debilitating. So whoever wants to take that on, or if both of you have some remarks on that, I'd be very interested to hear.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to kind of start, Chris, and feel free to kind of come in whenever. Yeah, I think, the antidote to shame, I would say, is kind of self-compassion. And if only it were as easy as kind of experiencing that, so quickly or suddenly. It actually, like anything like this, it takes place over time. And, childhood abuse and neglect is so devastating. It's usually perpetrated by somebody that is in a position of power and trust in relation to the child, and that's a parent or a caregiver, or maybe someone in the wider family. And so understandably, people will develop beliefs around the people closest to them, and a trauma that happens in relationships brings huge trauma in relationships. And so a lot on that. And, it was really interesting what you were talking about with, the patterns that people develop a long time ago to sort of keep them safe. And absolutely, a brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening world will find it much more difficult to go about in a more ordinary world and a more ordinary environment where there is no abuse. With those belief systems, and in terms of kind of dismantling them, we would have found in our research that the things that were kind of related to that and also quite related to growth were really around kind of two things, or two main strands. And one, Chris has touched a huge amount on there, which is really social resources and relationships, and healing relationships, really. And the second would have been more what I'm going to call like cognitive variables. And that's kind of like the thinking that is helpful for helping people to process this trauma and to kind of work their way through it. And I might start with kind of the latter, with the cognitive variables. And one thing that is the idea of acceptance of trauma and an acceptance of what has happened. Now, acceptance doesn't mean approval in any way. It's more an acknowledgement of the trauma rather than an avoidance of it, because we know that, triggers for trauma bring on very intense, very extreme, can be very extreme sort of emotional and physical reactions. And understandably, people want to avoid that. But we know when there's more of an avoidance of trauma and avoidance of what's happened, those symptoms don't just naturally resolve. And especially in the case of childhood abuse and neglect, where that's a trauma that's long-standing, it's repetitive, it happens during some of the most critical developmental periods. Children lose access to kind of a major source of support if the parent or caregiver is the source of the trauma. So accepting kind of that the trauma has happened, that it can't unhappen, was kind of a major factor. And in one of our studies, that seemed to have been promoted by supportive social systems. So it didn't just necessarily happen by itself, and it wasn't something that happened in isolation, but it was something that was promoted by supportive social systems. And if you think about your friends and the people closest to you and good networks, they do offer that. They offer, if you're disclosing something to them and you get a positive response, it will help you kind of process some of what you're telling them and some of what you've been through. They'll also maybe offer a new perspective on a way of thinking about something, or they'll offer you hope, or they'll offer you support, soothing, comfort, feelings of safety. All of those things are so important. So that was one of the first kind of cognitive variables we found. Having a greater understanding kind of the abuse. So it really is phenomenal. A lot of people, and maybe some people watching this might say that actually sounds a bit like me. I think some people have gone throughout their whole life not having a sense of what trust feels like, and being very difficult to trust other people. And if you've never experienced trust, how would you know what it feels like? And so people kind of think that this is how I will be living the rest of my life. But actually having a greater understanding of the abuse And that was linked to a really important kind of what we call cognitive task, which is rejecting personal responsibility for the behavior of the abuser.
Very good. Yes.
In one of our studies, one of the survivors had an excellent way of putting it. She was a survivor of institutional childhood abuse, and she said, "I never owned their bad behavior." And I thought that was just a really, really solid way of solidifying that, of just kind of rejecting that personal responsibility, acknowledging that they were culpable and I wasn't. And that's really important to loosen that grip of shame and self-blame, because like I said, unfortunately, a lot of survivors kind of carry that around with them for a long time. And that's a very painful belief to carry around for most of your life. And we know from both the research and working therapeutically with people that the interpretation of their trauma often comes from sort of the cause that they put in it. So who was responsible? And so that will also influence how they interpret their trauma, i.e. is it self-blame or is it external blame? Am I to blame or are they to blame? And that's very important in restoring the trauma, particularly when someone is carrying around a lot of guilt with them. Deborah Lee is a clinical psychologist, and she has it's a great saying I kind of picked up from her, and it said, if the mind of the other did not exist, you would not have been hurt or harmed in the way that you were. And it's really getting people to sort of internalize that message that what happened to you is not your fault. Because the characteristics of the abuse, we have to be conscious that when a child is young and when they've been abused or neglected, the abuser will use all sorts of tactics to sort of prevent the abuse being disclosed. So they might use threat and force, they might minimize, they might even suggest the child wanted it, they'll normalize it. So all of those things, when a child is kind of developing in those critical periods, when they don't have the psychological resources that a person would as an adult, during that time, a child will internalize all of that and will come to believe, actually, yes, what happened was my fault. I deserved this. I'm a bad person. So dismantling a lot of that, it's a longer term kind of task for sure. It's not something that should be an expectation for people in the long term, but something like that can certainly help to loosen the grip of shame and self-blame and guilt that people come bucket loads with, really.
So helpfully put, Grace, and I really resonated and connected with that they don't have to accept and nor approve of their experience in childhood of that experience of trauma, however it was manifested. So it's very much in service of and the spirit of validating one's own experiences and the recovery and hopeful place that can, if not accelerate, but allow someone to work through their trauma to come to a place of, to use the language you've used before, as post-traumatic growth, or to be, as we've titled this webinar, to move beyond trauma a little bit at a time. And just to come to you, Cariosa, in relation to some of what Grace has said, it feels as though that's in the ballpark of what you've been talking about trauma happening in relationships and also recovery happening in relationships, and how you might see that playing out, or what thoughts or observations even that you've had from listening to Grace for the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, I think an important point just to highlight is that even though you may come to a point in yourself of knowing it's not your fault, and it's not your fault logically, emotionally, you can still feel a sense of worthlessness. Why does this always happen to me? People people can defer back to an more familiar internalized feelings. And
yes,
I think that taps into what Grace was saying earlier about the work of coming, post-traumatic growth and of dealing with your past is ongoing, and
yes.
So it's very important to remember to remember that, and to notice what it is that begins that cycle again, because often it can be a cycle, and that to try and put language on this, and actually the fact that I'm struggling to put language on it is almost reflective of how it can be I speak to the therapy experience that a person really struggles to put language on what is happening, and so often that can show itself, their struggles can show itself in their behaviours. And so let's say in the counselling situation, that might be maybe turning up late, or kind of testing the relationship in some way that say, oh, am I tolerable? You know, often
Yes.
it can feel intolerable. There can be a lot of trying to, the foundation of trust. How do you establish trust? Because with our friends, sometimes we doubt our friends, you know, or the social context, say, oh, well, you know, you're my mom, you love me, you're going to tell me I'm great, do you know, or, you know, you're my friend. But in the therapy, because it's so boundaried, you know, and because you get to experience potentially a corrective emotional experience through
Yes.
the safety, the consistency, validation, non-judgment, and the curiosity and exploration of, oh, I notice you're kind of turning up late, or, you know, you're texting me in between sessions. I'm just wondering what that might be about for you. And like being curious about that and wondering what the meaning of it is for that person, because it's
Because
not
it
the
shows
same
that
for
you,
everyone.
yes, not the same for everyone, and it shows that you care, Carissa, and that you
Yeah,
shows that you want to try and accept a person for themselves and what's going on for them, and try and tease it out or grapple with it to find some meaning, because
yes.
it doesn't have to be like the way it was historically, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
Something new can emerge.
Exactly. And what is the meaning of this for the person, and why are they defaulting to this? And it'll be an old pattern, or it'll be a fear emerging, and to be able to be present to that. Like for me, I love the work of Donald Winnicott, who's, you know, talks about good enough parenting. And what he said about therapy was that it's not about making clever or apt interpretations, but that it's the slow reflecting back what the client brings to be seen. And I suppose in individual therapy, you can do that one-to-one with the counsellor, and because it's a specific type of relationship, and so it's almost like that, it can be like that mother-child, that, you know, the intensity of that. And but in group therapy, what I've, you know, witnessed through group therapy is how it allows the social element, because the boundaries are the same, of that you hold firm boundaries, and no socializing outside of the group. People come and they present themselves, but that all the work is done in the here and now of the relationship within the group. And while that can be very challenging in terms of what it puts the person in touch with, in terms of their fear of exposure, what will be seen, fear of attack, all of these things that people can worry about very, very justifiably in group, it also allows them to actually establish trust over time and see, oh,
Yes.
what is reflected back, and that something different of them can be reflected back. And while they might have difficulty in taking that in and internalizing it, if over time the person say, well, this is just what I see of you, this is just what I go, oh, well, there must be some truth in that, because all you are seeing of me is what I am bringing here. And so now that, as Grace was saying, is a very slow process. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of trust. And what's fundamental to all of this is safety.
Yes.
Without safety, none of this can occur. So that's a core piece.
Very helpful to hear, Carissa. Yeah, and real, very tangible and kind of live ideas around what can the journey of someone in a therapeutic space or in a counselling space, you know, and some of that in the here and now experience of that, of working through something or talking about a person's experience in the here and now is very much grist for the mill and active in the aware support groups with a different flavour to it, I suppose. But that's, you know, very helpful to hear you reflect on that. And just before we start inviting a few questions in from the audience, I just wanted to touch in a little bit about the impact, I suppose, broadly at a mental health level, you know, to do with the impact of trauma. But also from your experience, if we were to touch on areas of depression and bipolar and how that manifests, and what your experience of that is in relation to both conditions, both mood-related conditions, if you have a comment or two on that. Would you like to take that, Grace?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, look, you know, I think we so commonly hear really about depression, don't we? And it's not something necessarily that's experienced sort of in isolation. Actually, you know, across the board of mental health difficulties, it seems to be very, very prevalent. I think actually maybe Ireland has one of the highest rates of self-reported depression in Europe. It's quite a startling figure, and some research that's been done in Ireland kind of recently in the last 2 years has kind of shown that actually the rates of depression in people with diagnosis of PTSD and CPTSD are phenomenally high. Understandably, people feel sad and depressed and anxious about the things that have happened to them.
Yes.
Part of kind of working through trauma will also be working with some of those like more kind of features of depression that we might see, and that might be, you know, touching a lot on what Cariosa said about healing relationships. Really, when we are feeling depressed, we're starting to withdraw from people and start to withdraw from our relationships.
Yes.
And, you know, the feelings of safety that Cariosa touched on as well will need to be there in trauma relationships for us, or in relationships, sorry, you know, when we're recovering from trauma, to allow us to kind of go back into relationships or stop withdrawing from relationships. There's a lot of research that kind of points to the role of trauma as well in many mental health problems, including depression and also bipolar and psychosis and schizophrenia as well. And we know that people who are growing up in very threatening and frightening early life environments, we know that that has an impact on how the brain develops. And our brain is responsible for helping us to do things like regulate our emotions, understand our experiences. So when all of this gets impacted by an abuse that is consistent and repetitive and ongoing, and that's stripping us off social resources, and that's stripping us off support in our family, understandably, people are growing up with, you know, beliefs that are also characteristic of depression and for people with bipolar, and the emotional experiences that come with that as well.
Yeah, that's very helpful to hear that, Grace, because it's not about being linear. You know, the fact that you're at risk of experiencing depression in adulthood or in adolescence, you're more at risk if you've experienced a trauma in childhood, whatever the nature of that trauma. Yet it's not the linear aspect. Because of experienced trauma, I'm definitely going to be depressed, and I think that qualification or that understanding is important to bring. But it's very helpful hearing you describe it in that way, you know, because I suppose it's perhaps for people in the audience who have experienced a trauma or trauma in childhood, whatever the nature of it, or are here in the audience because they're a loved one of a person who's experienced trauma. It's trying to, as you've said earlier, Cariosa, too, about sharpening people's awareness or developing their understanding and informing people about the nature of it and what can happen in adulthood for people in that sphere, in that realm.
Yeah, and I think on that, Stephen, you know, it's really important to say, you know, to anyone kind of attending, to anyone who is watching this back, to anyone who's supporting somebody who's come through a trauma, if you are struggling to come to terms with the aftermath of an experience of trauma, if you are struggling with feelings of depression, if you are struggling with difficulties around bipolar, it's not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign that you're not able to cope with your life. It's just the way it is for you right now. And there could be lots of things in your life that are influencing those difficulties. You know, depression isn't something that's only in our mind. Depression is influenced at a psychological, at a social, at an environmental level, really, with us. And so often what I find is that people are just doing their best with the resources that they've had and the things that they've survived growing up. So for anyone listening, I think I'd like you to know, you know, you're not alone kind of in what's happened to you and what you're going through. What happened to you absolutely was not your fault, and that things can absolutely get better with the right supports. And it might take some time to find them. You might need some help to find them, but things can get better with those right supports.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Grace. Go on, Cariosa. Yeah.
I'd like to echo that because just to pick up on a point that Grace made earlier about the impact of trauma over time. So similarly, you have to think about, if that's how I've been impacted and internalized, you know, and come as a way of being in the world and to cope, then similarly in my recovery, I have to pay as much attention in my recovery. So that's why I really highlight, like, it's in the everyday, in things that really, of noticing what you are doing, what is helping. The more you pay attention to that, it's like what we practice, we become. You know, the more we pay attention to that, the more learning we get, the more we can inform ourselves. And so organizations such as Aware, that give information, give support and educate, can really help to feel a sense of empowerment and agency within yourself. As I develop more awareness about what helps me, then it also gives me more choice. Doesn't mean I'll always make the right choice, but you know, that I will begin to notice more what happens when I don't make a choice that supports me. Do you know, or when I didn't say no to a person that really maybe I think is a bit of a user and, you know, brings me down because they never call me back, or, you know, and that this can tap into my internalized feelings of worthlessness. Oh, there comes that bit of me again. Oh, you know, talking away. And that's how real it is, and that's how immediate it can be. And, you know, so about being able to say, now I have to quieten down that part of myself. It's not all of me, it's a part of me. And I need to take myself in hand here and have my toolkit of what I need, whether it might be going for a rigorous swim, whether it might be doing restorative yoga, whether it might be going to bed early, whether it might be tidying the house, you know, because being in a tidied atmosphere makes me feel more ordered inside. Whatever it is, you know, yeah.
The next right thing, healthy behaviours, a healthy choice in behaviour, insofar as is possible, and resonating with that comment earlier, that's good enough, that there's no such thing as perfection, and not striving for
and
that.
It's ongoing, that we're always learning. And this might seem like a little bit of a curveball, you know, because sometimes people do find, like, a lot of people find engaging socially very anxiety provoking, you know, and I think that's even been heightened over the pandemic, and how our relationships have all been impacted over the pandemic. So I'm a great advocate of pets, and, you know, so like you know, if you have a dog or a cat, you know, and something that you are in exchange with, caring for and feel cared by, you know, with the regard, it's just, don't underestimate how, you know, there are lots of ways for us to help ourselves, you know, and, you know, don't limit yourself. It's
message of hope to.
Yeah, definitely not one size fits all, as Grace said earlier.
Right.
You
know? Thank you.
Lovely as well, Karina, just a kind of final comment of that is that I think sometimes kind of healing and recovery can kind of seem maybe like looser kind of terms, but actually what you're describing is actually quite tangible things that are in people's everyday kind of lives, that kind of it's you know, the consistency of it and things like that. So yeah.
Great. Thank you for that, both. And just to feed up a few questions to you, you know, a comment came from a contributor in relation to the fear that is felt returning to work. And this is back to the relationship piece, I think, after a period of stress leave, where there's a breakdown of trust, and what kind of thoughts you might have on that, or kind of affirmative advice, without getting into too much advice or solution focused aspect of it, but what might be done to kind of maybe manage some of that fear, or can it be managed? What kind of ideas have you got on that?
Well, I can just give a few off the top of my head. You know, just for somebody to try and identify what's at the core of the fear. So there might be a few different aspects, like just because we've come out of a pandemic, so there might be the real thing around, you know, social proximity to people. So there might be some concrete things that you can manage, you know, in terms of social distancing in the office, or, you know, that aspect, or how you're going to commute in and out to work, and how a way that you might manage your anxiety around that. But it might also be a signpost or an indicator to something that might have been low level previously and is now kind of rearing its ugly head and more present. And it might be something that is is coming back again, as in the cyclical nature of things, that needs to be paid attention to. So only the person can know what the truth of that is for themselves, and to take kind of the truth of what the support is that they need. Try and identify concretely what they need in the workplace, you know, in their home life, and put that in place as much as they can. And then that will clear the space for more being able to be more present to what actually might be being picked at inside of themselves, and to begin to respond to that and think, you know, maybe this workplace isn't the right workplace, you know, or maybe maybe there's other things going on that only the person can know for themselves.
For themselves. Thanks, Cariosa. I was just wondering a little bit, someone made a comment about being free from trauma, and I think we've talked about that a little bit, about how you work to become freer, but this definitive position of being completely free or free is maybe not too much, what's the word I'm looking for? It's supposed to be unattainable in a way, because we can't fully erase what has happened. We can't undo, but we can work through something. So it is that message of hope and recovery, and correct me if I'm wrong here, both, you know, but that the idea being that a space of being completely free goes against some of what we've been talking about, because we have to accept something of what has happened to us in that it has happened, without approving of it.
It's an experience, you know, like everything that we have, it's an experience, and so it can't be unexperienced, but the meaning of it can be changed.
That's it.
And so that's just to kind of refer back to something I said earlier. It's about kind of learning to live with, and seeing there will be aspects, and Grace talked about this as well, aspects of the trauma that has made the person like tap into aspects of themselves that they may never have tapped into, you know, and channeled their energy in a way that they may never have channeled their energy, and so it's about trying to integrate that experience of it not being all bad or all good or all gone, you know. It's trying to integrate this, that it's a part of, but does not define. It doesn't define.
Great, thank you. Do you have a word on that, Grace?
Yeah, I think kind of in, you know, from my experience of working with people with trauma, usually when people want to be free or desperately trying to get away from it, it's because it feels like it's controlling them and it's controlling their emotions. And a part of kind of, you know, Grace has kind of put it so lovely, kind of living with, and it's that acceptance of this has happened, this can't be unchanged, but bringing it into kind of the narrative of your life really will be really important, because there'll be a sense of kind of greater control over that, and over the kind of the emotional responses and the physical responses that come with it. But yeah, I kind of would kind of echo what you said.
Great. Thanks, Grace. Just in relation to that, perhaps, Grace, there's a comment regarding getting copies of your studies. So we might link in afterwards, if that's okay with you, to give people access to that, or a link to that. So, and someone was thankful of your descriptions of it, you know, and referencing the research. And also, Grace and Cariosa, you know, a person has mentioned that they have a learning disability, and would there be any accessible or easy to read resources that are around trauma that you might recommend, both of you?
Off the top of my head right now, I can't, but there absolutely would be, and maybe that's something, a resource that we might be able to kind of link, or to provide someone with a link to. But yeah, off the top of my head, sorry, unfortunately I don't at the moment. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm the same, which is, and I personally don't have any experience of working with people who have a learning disability, but so I'm not familiar either. But I will go off and look it up and tap into colleagues and give you any information I come up with, Stephen, that person could be.
That'd be great, and yeah, we can distribute that information ourselves, if the person wants to contact us at info@aware.ie in relation to that. and that links will also be under links that you may give to us. And thank you again, will be under the video on the website, which is very helpful for people to access and get further information from the discussion that we've had. There's a person here with a question or a comment in relation to having recurrent dreams and night terrors, and wondering what your thoughts are on these sleep disturbances in relation to a traumatic event that happened when they were 15, and that's 20 years ago.
I mean, I'm happy to kind of
go, yeah.
So that would probably be one of the, look, without kind of a bit more of a thorough kind of question and answer around it really, and kind of an individual assessment. But it sounds like what it could be is what kind of a classic or nearly a signature symptom of PTSD, which is like a re-experiencing of the event. And that usually comes about in the form of unwanted memories that intrude in. So they're intrusive, they're unwanted, they're quite frightening. Nightmares, flashbacks, they're a particularly distressing part of PTSD. When people experience that, and because it leaves people with the feeling that they're back in that moment, and that the trauma is alive in the present moment, and that they're back at the time of the trauma. Understandably, there's a significant kind of emotional and physical reaction to that, and people want to avoid it. I might suggest that, if that is something that's causing you a lot of distress and kind of filtering in throughout your life, and that's really having an impact on kind of your thoughts, your feelings, behaviours, kind of in work or social life. I think you had kind of flagged it earlier, Stephen, maybe kind of linking in with your GP will be a useful start, and the general practitioners are kind of a good kind of segue into more specific kind of services around mental health for that. But yes, absolutely, if it's something that you're finding quite distressing, I would always recommend that there's a lot of evidence-based treatment options out there, and things can get better and those symptoms can resolve.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Grace. Great. And there was a question there from a contributor, a participant, to say that they were wondering how to help. They didn't say whether the teenager is related to them, but a teenager who's experienced early childhood trauma is finding it hard to engage with therapy. They're 16, 17 years of age.
Yeah, that's a hard one, because
yeah.
Therapy isn't for everyone, and the therapeutic relationship is a relationship. So just because you go to a counsellor doesn't mean you'll automatically click with the first counsellor you go to.
Yes.
And so it's important, again, that you trust yourself and trust your sense of, do I feel that this person has some sort of understanding about where I'm coming from, and has a genuine curiosity about what I have been through in my life. And I suppose with teenagers particularly, talk therapy can be a little bit too much and too intense for them. And so there can be, I know there are a number of agencies, of course I'm drawing a blank now because I'm in public, but I know
Jigsaw is one of them. Yeah.
I was thinking of the Tony Bates one of Jigsaw, and there's another one which is a befriending, a mentoring organisation that was a young person and an older. I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head now, but where somebody is befriending, and so such things as sport, art, music, ways that people can
express themselves,
writing, like journaling is another great way, or just creative writing, can find a way of externalizing or getting something that's inside out of you.
Very good.
So that would be the way. Again, it's not one size fits all. They're just some suggestions.
Thanks. We've got time for two more points, and just one that's maybe more informative at the end, and then just the last question, to you both is can the experience of reacting to trauma, it's from a contributor, be it a breakdown psychosis as it's written in, or depression, represent as a cause of further trauma? It's that kind of idea of what exacerbates it, I think, and what might happen if, around the experience of psychosis or a depressive episode spur on further trauma, or what your thoughts on that are. Again,
it's kind of not an one size sort of fits all.
Yeah.
But we do know that for people who are going through really frightening, terrifying experiences like psychosis, that actually a lot of their other resources will be down. So if you're experiencing psychosis, you know, the parts of your brain that are responsible for helping you kind of reason and understand information and things like that, that will get impacted. So people are probably at more risk of experiencing re-victimization or other traumatic experiences, because the resources are already down, because those mental health difficulties are already taking so much for them in those moments. And, you know, psychosis is something that's very acute. You know, it doesn't last forever, but it is very acute. And within that time period, it kind of eats up all the resources a person has. So yes, I would say that there's a strong chance people are at risk of further victimization. It's again not necessarily a given, and it's very hard because it's not a one size fit all. There is other factors kind of influencing it there. I think with any of those difficulties, if you have solid supportive systems around you that kind of meet those needs, those basic human needs that people didn't get met during childhood if they were abused or neglected, and that's for love and safety and security, and to have that at a baseline, and to have that to kind of help ground kind of somebody when they're coming out of these very unusual and frightening experiences, that's what is in the kind of the controllable. So sometimes with these experiences, and like with trauma, it's unpredictable, it's uncontrollable, and psychosis often shares some of those characteristics as well. So I would say that yes, there is people can be traumatized after those experiences for various reasons, and it might be things that they did, things that somebody else did when they were psychotic. It's not a given, but I can absolutely see how that would make sense.
Thank you. Yeah. That's helpful, Grace. And just a final one from a practical, as I said, or an informative perspective, any resources or books that you would point people to that we can again flag underneath this video on our website when we upload it. But thoughts that come to mind, I think there was, in our preparation for this webinar, we had a bit of a discussion around that, and it's interesting that that's come up. I'm always a bit kind of cautious around that, because what works for one might not work for another, but I can absolutely kind of give out a few. Karen Traceman is a psychologist that I really like her stuff. It's very accessible. She has a TED talk on healing after trauma, and it's really around healing relationships, and that good relationships are the key to healing after trauma. That's Karen Traceman, is it?
Yeah, so it's Karen and then T-or-E-I-S-M-A-N, and she has a YouTube channel, and they're quite short, and she gives resources and kind of coping skills, and she has her whole expertise is in, I can't say her whole expertise, but she's a phenomenal amount of expertise in working with childhood trauma. I guess, yeah, it depends on kind of what you like. If you're kind of more of a kind of a visual or an audio kind of person, or if you're a reader, I found Oprah Winfrey's book on what happened to you. I thought it was excellent. It was very accessible. I also just find it very interesting because it talks a bit about the neuroscience behind our brain and kind of how that gets impacted by trauma, and it relates it to kind of very kind of everyday things. And Cariosa would have touched upon them, like, why can't I say no? Or I find it difficult to say no to that person who's always using me. It brings a lot more understanding on that. They're kind of two.
That's great. That's helpful, Grace. And Cariosa?
I have a few. So actually Tony Bates' book on coming through depression is a really accessible book. It's a few years old now, but it's still very, very relevant. So that you'll get that in Eason's. There's an American psychologist called Tara Brach. It's B-R-A-C-H is her last name, and she does a lot of work around self-compassion. And and a lot of stuff where for people who are interested in are curious about themselves and self-help, how to begin to pay attention to themselves. There's also a book called Mindfulness, which is Finding Peace in a Frantic World, and that's by Mark Williams and Danny Penman. So that's another one around paying attention and again what we can do in the everyday. And I suppose a book that has come up again and again over the years in my work through different trainings and everything that I've read myself and found quite powerful is Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And certainly the first half of that book, it's only a very small little book, but you know, the first half of that where he talks about absolutely unbelievably horrendous experiences and how he was able to find meaning from it, and how it is in our meaning making that we can begin to make sense of things.
Exactly. Thank you, Cariosa and Grace, and spoken as a true psychotherapist, you know, the finding of the meaning. And I want to thank you both very much for your time, your contributions, and your considered experience and expertise in the whole area of trauma, mental health, post-traumatic growth, as people strive to find that space to heal and grow. You know, it's been a very lively and also informative conversation for me, and I hope that all the audience that have taken part, and you yourselves as the main contributors, have taken a great deal from it, because I certainly have. And to thank you all for your questions. And again, just to reiterate, if you have been impacted or activated by any of the material that's come up this afternoon, please reach out to people that are of support to you in your lives, whether that's at a personal level or more professionally with a GP. It may be someone's first journey into accessing help after an event of trauma or a traumatic childhood. So to please reach out for support. You can also get support from Aware through the various different support services that we offer, and you'll get further information on that on our website, aware.ie. Our support line number is open 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. 7 days a week, and that's a free phone number of 1-800 80 48 48. So you can use that service as well if you feel the need to. And just also for the audience to invite you to complete a survey that you'll receive after this webinar has finished, you know, and to complete that, to give us feedback, because that informs us about how to improve our offering and also gives us an idea of how we're doing. You can also sign up to our webinar newsletter to get notified each month about further upcoming topics on aware.ie/webinars. And next month, September, our webinar is going to be about the impact of alcohol on our mental health, and that'll take place on Wednesday, the 14th of September at 12 noon. And as I said, in relation to further information, you know, our website, aware.ie. And again, a last minute comment of thank you to Cariosa, Grace, and all the contributions from our participants. And we look forward to seeing you in September, and have a lovely afternoon ahead, and enjoy the rest of the summer. Cheerio, folks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.